I'm Drake Menning, and this is my video summary number 4. Chapter 5 is about constitutional principles, and the first key point talked about is the Constitution. It basically explains what we already know, that the Constitution gives the structure for our legal system and government along with protecting our rights. The next key point talked about is the principle of federalism, which is about power being divided between state and federal governments. While state and federal governments can both have separate authority when laws conflict, federal law rules under the Supremacy Clause and federal preemption. The next key point discussed is the separation of powers. This basically designates what each branch of government is in charge of. The legislative branch enacts laws, the executive branch sees that the laws are carried out, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. The President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and makes sure the laws are carried out. The Commerce Clause is the next key point discussed in Chapter 5. This gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Taxing and spending powers of the federal government is the next point discussed. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution discusses this point, which gives government the power to collect taxes and spending power by authorizing it to pay debts. The question of taxation of the Internet was also discussed. With the rise of Internet commerce, it was discussed that some states were seeking ways to collect sales tax from Internet sales. The impacts of the amendments on business was another key point discussed. The first 10 amendments, which are the Bill of Rights, have an impact on government regulation of the legal environment of business. The First Amendment was discussed and how it guarantees the right to freedom of speech, press, and religion, but these rights are not allowed when it will hurt another's reputation or the statements are not true. Another point discussed was the Fourth Amendment, which protects people's rights by prohibiting the government from conducting searches of individuals or property without a warrant. Also discussed was the Fifth Amendment, which comes up a lot when a defendant is being questioned and they don't want to say anything that can be held against them later. It protects individuals against self-incrimination and double jeopardy and guarantees the right to trial by jury. The last key point of Chapter 5 talks about the 14th Amendment and how it is important because it applies the Due Process Clause to the state governments and the Equal Protection Clause, under which states must give everyone equal protection and not discriminate. Although I have learned much of this information before, reading and relearning the points of this chapter have shown me how the Constitution can impact our daily living and the importance of knowing and understanding our rights. As a citizen and an accountant, knowing the structure of the legal system is important, as the amendments protect our rights in a business setting as well as private, and many of the amendments have an impact on business regulations. They can be very helpful to know about and will help protect my rights as a businessman. Chapter 6 discusses the white-collar crime in the business community. The first key point is crime and criminal procedure. It talks about criminal law and punishing offenders for various crimes and how each crime is classified. There are felonies, which are serious crimes. There are misdemeanors, which are less serious, and petty crimes, which are minor crimes. There is a criminal procedure, which usually starts with an arrest of the defendant. There must be probable cause that the suspect has committed the crime, and a suspect must be read their Miranda rights, which are legal rights stating that they have the right to remain silent to avoid self-incrimination, and they have the right to an attorney. The booking or filing of a criminal charge is next, and the first appearance in front of the judge to determine if there's probable cause for arrest. Bail can be paid if the defendant has enough money to pay the court to be released until it is time for their trial. If a crime is a misdemeanor, the next step of prosecution is information, which is a formal written accusation. For a felony case, the next step would be an indictment by a grand jury. The next part of the criminal procedure is the arraignment, where the defendant states if they plead guilty or not guilty. The next step would be the trial. There could also be a plea bargain, which is an agreement between the defendant's attorney and the prosecutor, where they plead guilty to a certain charge, usually a lesser charge, in exchange for the prosecutor reducing the charges. If the defendant has a trial and they do not agree with the decision, they can appeal the decision, which will be the last step. The next key point is distinguishing the features of white-collar crime. White-collar crime is basically a crime committed in a business setting by someone within the business, usually a professional in a white-collar job. As there are different types of white-collar crimes, it was discussed as whether a corporation could be liable for criminal acts committed by employees. Corporations are usually held liable for any criminal acts by their employees, although the individual employee can also be held responsible. Arguments in support of corporate liability and against corporate liability in the corporate executives were then discussed. The next key point talks about the factors that contribute to white-collar crime. This can be society stressing material success, workers want rewards of salary or promotion, and often those within a company are reluctant to bring up the fact that a practice may have been illegal. Other factors include the ease of rationalizing illegal behavior and the fact that decision-making is spread among so many people and it is hard to control who is doing what. There is also a lack of any corporate or government regulations or personal policies within a corporation. The sentencing of white-collar criminals was the next key point. It was discussed that sentencing for white-collar crime is much more lenient than for those convicted of street crimes. Common types of white-collar crimes were discussed, such as bribery, criminal fraud, larceny, embezzlement, and computer crimes. The next key point was how to prevent white-collar crime, as we are all victims. It was discussed that a corporation or business should have someone looking after the day-to-day functions of the corporation or business to make sure all activities are legal. Federal laws used to fight white-collar crime were discussed. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act is a federal law that basically prohibits business people from engaging in a pattern of racketeering or other types of white-collar crimes. Other laws discussed were the False Claims Act, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and the Whistleblower Protection Act. In global dimensions of white-collar crime, with improvements in technology, white-collar crime has increased worldwide. Many efforts are being taken to control white-collar crime, such as the Convention of Cybercrime, which is an effort of several countries. Although I would hope that as an accountant, the criminal procedures will not have an impact on my job, it is good to know about various types of crimes and to make sure I follow the laws to avoid any of this. If anything were to ever happen, I do now know my rights. As an accountant, I could be impacted by white-collar crime. I need to make sure I follow all the laws and rules very carefully and conduct business by the proper standards, code of conduct, and business ethics. It is important for me to not only make sure I do not do anything wrong to keep myself out of trouble, but my entire company could be held liable if I were to do anything illegal. It is also important to keep an eye on others and not be afraid to speak up if I suspect legal activity from others.